Hello and welcome to the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, which is usually known as SANHS. My name is Lizzie Induni and I'm the chair for SANHS. In this evening's lecture, Tom Mayberry will be talking about the SANHS archives. Tom was the chief executive of the South West Heritage Trust until his retirement at the end of 2023. In that role, he was responsible for a range of services in Devon and Somerset relating to archives, museums, and the historic environment. Having returned from Winchester to Somerset in the 1980s to be an archivist at the old Somerset Record Office, he became the county's head of heritage in 2004 and worked with remarkable colleagues to create the Somerset Heritage Centre at Norton Fitzwarren and the Museum of Somerset at Taunton Castle. A few years later, Somerset's Rural Life Museum in Glastonbury was also remade. He's been a member of Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society for 40 years and its local history committee member for over 30. He's written and lectured widely on West Country history. In today's lecture, to make things simple, Tom will take questions at the end of the talk. And as you all know, please put your questions in via the chat button. It's free to register for the talks, but a donation of £5 towards ongoing costs of SANHS would be greatly appreciated. The donations button is on the SANHS website donations page. When donating, please label your donation archives. To make things easier, a link to the donations page will also be posted on the chat button at the end of the lecture. So, over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I'll just share my screen so that you can see the pictures, I hope. I'm hoping you can see that. Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up, which is good. On the 26th of September 1849, Sir Walter Calverley-Trevelyan of Nettlecombe Court presided at the very first annual meeting of Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society. That meeting took Market House in the centre of Taunton, a building which is no longer there, sadly. And in his address that day, Sir Walter naturally praised the richness and diversity of the county, which was the subject matter of the new society. He praised in particular its archaeology, its natural history, and he expressed the wish that one of the objects of the society should be to create a library and a museum. As a man with a landed estate and strong rooms bulging with historic archives, he was also someone who was alert to the importance of archives. And he added in his address that the ancient papers preserved among family records in this county were very valuable, and there were few things of greater interest than the correspondence of former times. Others at that first meeting included representatives of other landed families, such as the Dickinsons and the Horners. And so, although archives were always, as it were, overshadowed by archaeology and natural history in the annals of the society, they were something central to its endeavours in a quiet way from the very beginning. At that first meeting, they set up a temporary museum, as they did at many subsequent meetings. And on that first occasion, one of the treasures that was displayed was the recently discovered Wellington reredos. Here we see a coloured lithograph of how it looked when it had first been discovered in St. John the Baptist Church in Wellington in 1848. But another item that was displayed that day had been brought by the Reverend Hildaw Wickham of Frome, and it was a reputed charter of King Ina or King Ini, dated or reputedly dated 705. And it was to become, a few years later, the foundation stone of the Society's archival collection and it is indeed the foundation stone of the archival collections of the county as a whole. There is nothing older than this charter. And there in the stained glass window, you see King Einar commemorated in Curryrival Church. It's not that records hadn't been preserved in the county before the society was inaugurated in 1849. The official records of the county, at least, had been preserved for a long time. And indeed, Somerset was one of the first counties in England to set up specific provision for the preservation of its records. In 1617, a record room was created on the north side of Wells Cathedral, just next to the chain gate. And you can see it there as the building with the double doors and the two paths leading to it. And had you gone through those double doors, you would have found a room fitted out with a table so that you could even go and search through what were the records of quarter sessions if you really wanted to. It was, in a way, one of England's prototype public record offices. The records it contained, the records chiefly of quarter sessions, had various homes over the following centuries. There was a home in Wilton Jail in Taunton, but then in 1858, a new home was found for the county records at Shire Hall, newly built to house the assize courts. The Lord Lieutenant presided at the opening ceremonies, and he was Lord Portman, the first Viscount Portman. He was also a prominent member of SANHS, as was his brother, the rector of Staple Fitzpaine. And Lord Portman, on that occasion, referred to the record room at the back of the building, and he said, "We are obliged to keep our records, but they will wear out in time and certainly be a loss to no one." It's interesting to reflect that he was a prominent member of the society, but his opinion reflected what was a widespread opinion, that records were really very secondary as historical sources. And certainly there was no systematic attempt to maintain them for the most part. The society, however, despite its primary focus on archaeology and natural history, became a collector from the very beginning. Records of acquisitions are extremely patchy in the early days, and the first recorded archive acquisition happened in 1862, when the society was given a deed of property in Bristol. It's the fate of archive collecting organizations, and indeed museums as well, to find their strong rooms full of things that relate to the wrong place. But we'll let Bristol off because it's not that far away. And there is the Newmarket House, the home of that very first archive. And the gentleman that you see seated there is a Tauntonian called Edward Jebold. And he is responsible, or was responsible, in 1867 for the second recorded acquisition by the Society. But he presented SANHS with 4 volumes relating to the manor of Taunton Deane. And from then on, the trickle of records at times became almost a tidal wave of acquisitions. That became much easier after 1874, when the Society acquired the dilapidated Taunton Castle. Here was a very large building capable of accommodating much more than the rooms in the Newmarket House. And there, in the oil painting, you see William Bidgood, one of the early curators and one of the most important curators for the Society, who was appointed in 1865 and was described as genial and many-sided. And although he was at heart a natural historian, he didn't neglect to collect such archives as came his way. One of the Society's largest collections and most important collections and one of the earliest major collections that it received archivally came from Wells, and from a man called Thomas Serrell of Wells. He was a founder member of the society, and in his working life, a bookseller in Sadler Street, which you see there. He'd been collecting and rescuing documents at least since 1840, because he had been shocked and distressed when he discovered that the contents of the Dean's Registry in the West Cloister at Wells Cathedral had been used to light fires in the Theological College. And in 1871, he spoke to the society and told of his outrage that records were so neglected, and of his own endeavours, now over a period of more than 30 years, to rescue what he could. I'm trying to think what date it was. Yes, it was in 1879. The society decided that it would be inspired by Thomas Serrell's example and offer to buy his now enormous collection of records. And they arrived with the society, hundreds of bound volumes of records, mostly rescued from various parts of the cathedral. And here is just one of them with Thomas Serrell's bookplate, a volume labelled Wells Deanery, etc. Manuscripts, 1574 to 1842. And they weren't just records from the cathedral, they were records rescued from the town itself. Here, for example, in the Society's collection is an account book and a proceedings book of the Wells Cordwainers Company, dating 1606 to 1720. And you can see the Society has appended its bookplate and noted that the volume has been purchased. Thomas Serrell did many good turns for history, and perhaps not least, he rescued many, many wills. In 1858, probate jurisdiction of the ecclesiastical courts came to an end. And what proved true then proved true so often before and since, that when an organization ceases to be responsible for a particular function, the records of that function become exceptionally vulnerable. Here's a volume of wills in the Serrell collection, covering the period 1539 to 41. And of course, any wills from before 1858 are particularly valuable in Somerset, because in 1942, a Baedeker raid on Exeter destroyed the probate registry, and with it, all the remaining early wills of Somerset. But you can see some of the perils from which Thomas Serrell had rescued the documents in his care. For on the flyleaf of that volume of wills, he's written, these fragments were rescued from a butcher's shop in Wells, where the book of which they had formed a part was being broken up for wrapping steaks, chops, etc. for customers. And he follows that with 4 exclamation marks. So William Serrell is owed a great debt, not just by the Society, but by Somerset historians generally, for the massive work of rescue and preservation that he achieved. And his collection is overall the largest and most important of all the archives that are contained in the SANHS collection. In 1886, a circular was received by the Society from the Society of Antiquaries in London, emphasizing the need to preserve court rolls and deeds. And SANHS wasn't slow in circulating local secretaries of historical organizations, various other societies and individuals, trying to persuade them that they should give or deposit documents of that kind with the Society for preservation. They took very seriously the commission, as it were, that the Society of Antiquaries had given. And part of their rationale was their wish to create an ambitious and complete county history of Somerset. That ambition was first mentioned in 1858 and regularly recurred over the decades, and was only really properly fulfilled in 1967, when the topographical volumes of the Victoria County History of Somerset began to be published, and were dependent not least on the records the Society had preserved a century before. As a result of that trawl for records, many documents began to arrive at Taunton Castle. Some were purchased. The Society appears to have purchased manorial records at the Hestercombe House sale in about 1874, when the wars gave up Hestercombe, or when the last of the wars died, in fact. And here is a portion of a court roll of the Manor of Broomfield from 1409, relating to the War family. And those manorial records that the Society of Antiquaries had particularly highlighted began to arrive as well. Here is an account roll for the Manor of North Petherton, beginning at a very early date in 1290 and covering the period up to 1313. And here a court roll for the same Manor of Petherton from 1296 to 1333. It's impossible to say what might have happened to those records if the Society hadn't rescued them, hadn't taken them in. But the likelihood is that they wouldn't survive today. And as for deeds, well, they came in all shapes and sizes. There are acquisitions which now are often from unknown sources. And it was said that by 1926, the Society had 5,000 deeds covering 320 parishes. And they began at a very early date. Here's one of the earliest acquisitions and one of the oldest. It's a grant by William de Frithorn to Thomas Tragan of about 1150 of a virgate of land, evidently at Cheriton in Devon. And here, a copy from about 1200 of a charter of Henry I, dating originally from 1154 to 68, whereby Henry II confirms all the grants given by his grandfather Henry I, by William the Count of Mortain, and by other barons of England and Normandy to the Church of St. Peter of Montacute. Sometimes we know who gave these documents in the early days. This document, for example, was given by George Weir Breckenridge, who's known particularly to the Society as the man who commissioned that enormously valuable collection of watercolours, chiefly by W. W. Wheatley and S. G. Tovey. And here, for example, is a Breckenridge document, a charter of Edward III from 1332, granting the Abbot of Glastonbury a fair at Sturminster in Dorset and weekly markets at Ditchett, Rington and Weston in Somerset, and another at Merton in Wiltshire. Again, what would have happened to such documents if they hadn't been rescued? It's difficult to know. This is another Breckenridge gift to the Society, a fifthment or deed poll by Thomas de Drockensford of the Manor of Alston with a windmill in 1345. And monastic documents too. Here, Muchenley Abbey in 1532, an appointment by the Abbot John Sherborne of John Cuff and his son John Cuff to the office of auditor. And with the seal still largely surviving appended to it. In that trawl for records following the Society of Antiquaries persuasion, the Society had also sought to rescue the records of various small boroughs in Somerset, Axbridge, Ilchester, and Langport in particular, because they'd lost their status under the Municipal Corporations Act in 1883. There was no result from that plea that those records should be handed to the Society, but nevertheless, certain borough records came to the Society's care nevertheless. Here's some letters patent of Henry V from 1415, granted to the burgesses of Ilchester, pardoning them for all their arrears of the farm of the town. And here, a very rare survival from the early borough records of Taunton. It's a seal from a document of 1509, but the seal itself is an impression from the 12th century borough seal of Taunton, showing a castle with turrets on either side, a seal which seems to have been inspired by the seal of the city of Exeter. The borough records seem to have vanished soon after the first corporation was dissolved in 1792, or perhaps before. But the reality is that very little survives of Taunton's borough archives from an early date. Some items which came to the Society in those early days were perplexing, and their significance wasn't really understood for a very long time. This is a document which now is called the Taunton Fragment, 2 of the 4 leaves which were given to the Society in the 19th century. It's an Anglo-Saxon manuscript from about 1050 in Old English and Latin alternately. I remember when I was a young archivist, I would often look at this document in the SANHS collection in the strong rooms. No one took much interest in it, but I could see that it was something special, though quite why it was special was difficult to determine. And it was obviously Old Anglo-Saxon. And when in about the year 2000, we did a little exhibition at the museum, when the Athelney cartlery was discovered, a little exhibition on Alfred's Somerset, I believe it was called. We displayed this document as coming broadly from that period and described it, I think it was described by me as a commentary on the Gospels, and that's what the label said. It so happened that one of the greatest Anglo-Saxon or Old English scholars in the world, Professor Simon Keynes, visited the museum and saw it there. He was outraged by my caption, given that it was quite clear to him that this was by no means a commentary on the Gospels. But apart from that, what he was immediately able to recognize was that this was a document of extraordinary rarity. In a period of over 250 years, only about a dozen Old English narrative manuscripts have been added to the complete corpus of such documents. And here was another, the first that had come to light for many, many years. And soon it was written up by a great scholar whom you see in the second picture there, whose name was Mechthild Gretsch. And the document was hailed as a major event in Anglo-Saxon studies. It was written in England. It's in alternating Latin and Old English. And it's a bilingual homiletic text, unlike any previously known from Anglo-Saxon England. So a thing of extraordinary importance. And of course, Simon Keynes and Mechthild Gretsch were credited with discovering the document, but I sit here rather aggrieved at that, since I knew about it long before. The only trouble is I didn't know why it was important. The Society received certain, as it were, complete collections, a bit like Thomas Searle's in the early days. And one came from the estate of a man called John Haviland. He'd been born in 1792 at Gundenham near Wellington. He went off to fight in Russia. He had an adventurous life, and he was persuaded by John Quincy Adams to try his luck in the United States of America. For he was an architect by training, and architects were very rare things in the United States. He settled in Philadelphia, and he became one of the leading architects of the early Republic. And there you see just one of his buildings, the Washington Square Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia, built in the 1820s and demolished in 1839. He was chiefly famous for building penitentiaries, prisons, and several of those still survive in the United States. The collection was given by his son, another John Haviland, or John de Haviland, as he called himself, who came back to England, became a leading light in the College of Arms, and finally chose burial back in his ancestral county at Langford Budville, where a window was placed there by him while he was still living in memory of his father, and you can still see it there in the South Aisle, in memory of John de Haviland, inventor of radiating prisons. That is the panopticon principle for prisons. So if you're ever in Langford Budville Church, do go to the east end of the South Aisle and look at the window in memory of John Haviland, the American architect. Sometimes a collection is not, as it were, rediscovered for a long time, just as the Taunton fragments in their true significance remained undiscovered. I went into the museum once many years ago, in about 2000 probably, when the then county museums officer, Steve Minnett, said to me, "We've got a mahogany box here in the basement. It's been here for over a century and nobody knows what to do with it." It had been left in the museum because it was a mahogany box. It was a thing. It was an object. But when you opened the lid, it was full of archives. And for years, no one could decide whether it was a museum object or an archive. But Steve was fed up with this box gathering dust. And since I was an archivist, he handed it to me. And I eagerly carried it back to the old Somerset Record Office and opened it and discovered that it was filled with hundreds of letters written to and from Edwin Atherstone, who had been a teacher in Taunton for a long time, and then an aspiring but failed poet. The letters recorded his friendship in particular with the artist John Martin, who used to come and visit him in Taunton, but also correspondence with Sir Walter Scott, with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, with William Godwin, with all kinds of people, with Charles Lamb and with Robert Southey. It was one of the most exciting archival moments of my career. And it was wonderful, much more recently in 2024, to be able to realize a long-held ambition to have an exhibition at the Museum of Somerset relating to the work of John Martin and his friendship with Edwin Atherstone. You see the exhibition in John Martin's painting, The Destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum, there at the lower right. At the top left, you see the Somerset Room of Taunton Castle, as it looked in its museum days in about the 1890s. And you'll see on the wall there on the left, a large painting canted outwards with a curved top. That is the painting that Edwin Atherstone's daughter, Mary Elizabeth, gave to the museum in the 1880s, along with that mahogany box or writing slope. And below it, you see the letter where the Society sold it in 1946 to the Tate Gallery for £100. It seems such a shame. And there's the painting itself as it now hangs in Tate Gallery. In those early days, there were all kinds of miscellaneous gifts. Here, a printed text of a work by Cicero given by Alexander Russell of Stoke St. Mary to C.E. Giles, one of the early pillars of the society, one of its founders indeed, the man, in fact, who had discovered the Wellington reredos. And here, just really what was a very pretty document, something that was great to look at, which had no Somerset connection at all, but which was gladly taken in simply because it didn't have a home and it was clearly a thing of value and interest. And a formulary in Anglo-Norman French from the late 14th century. Late in the 19th century, a few scholars came along who had a more purposeful view of what needed to be done. And one of them was Bishop Hobhouse, who had been Bishop of Nelson in New Zealand, but who retired to home territory in Somerset and became what he'd always wanted to be, an antiquary. If I won't try and say that word again, but you know what I'm trying to say. He was a founder of the Somerset Record Society, a very important member of SANHS, and he began to become an editor of the fundamental texts of county history. He was the editor, for example, of the register of Bishop John de Drockenford, the earliest surviving bishop's register, which is still preserved in the Cathedral Library. No, it's not. It's preserved in the Record Office, isn't it? Yes, it is. My apologies. But it's not part of the Society's collection. Here is something which came into the SANHS collection through the aegis of Bishop Hobhouse, a cartulary of Minchin Buckland Priory in Durston, which would be edited by the Somerset Record Society in 1906 by F.W. Weaver, another stalwart of SANHS. And here the Hungerford Cartulary, again, a document which, whose passage into the Society's hands was facilitated by Bishop Hobhouse, and which was only published in relatively recent times by the Wiltshire Record Society. And here, another stray document with monastic origins, given by Thomas Kerslake, a Bristol bookseller. It's a copy of Ralph Higden's Polychronicon from about 1377. And at the end is an inscription that records that it came from the library of Keynsham Abbey. So it's a wonderful survival, wonderful that such a book should have survived from Somerset's monastic past. A watershed for the Society and for its archive collections came in the year 1901, when Harold St. George Grey, after the death of William Bidgood, was appointed as the new honorary curator and librarian. It wouldn't be right to mention Harold St. George Grey without also mentioning his wife Florence and their son Lionel. And you see Florence in the distance there, and Lionel sitting on one of the stones at Avebury. It's in a way appropriate that Florence is almost indecipherable there, because although she was a very prominent figure in the annals of the Society, she stayed in the background. She cast a sharply etched shadow, but we rarely, as it were, see her face to face. When she died in 1970 at the age of 95, the last survivor of a golden age of the Society's history, she was described as a person of strong character, and she could be a formidable and implacable protagonist when she felt that the interests of the Society were being threatened. But she was absolutely fundamental in supporting the work of her husband as curator, and we'll find the evidence of her presence all over the place. She was the person who so often docketed documents and museum finds in such a way that we know today what they are and where they came from. Here, for example, is a folio from a Latin Bible from the 14th century given to the Society. And it's Florence St. George Gray who records in that little label that it was given by Mr. Edward Sloper in 1905, or bequeathed by him. And there is another object which came in early in St. George Gray's time, and again bearing a label in the hand of Florence St. George Gray, recording that it was presented by Hugh Norris of South Petherton in 1904. And it shows you the breadth, the richness, and the miscellaneousness of the documents which were accruing to the Society. It's a book of arithmetic from 1642 belonging to William Fort of South Petherton. And there's another page from it. It's a wonderful, colourful document. And this, another document from those days after 1901, arriving without particular rhyme or reason, but gradually, bit by bit, vastly enriching the preserved evidence of Somerset and other history. It's an ink drawing, and this is only a tiny part of a document which unrolls to about 30 feet, of the funeral procession of Elizabeth I in 1603, supposedly by William Camden Clarenceau, King at Arms. Because Harold St. George Gray, despite being fundamentally an archaeologist, took a keen interest in archives, Society members did too. And those who had the money and the ability to do so began to purchase things and give them to the Society, even more fully than had happened in the 19th century. Sometimes there were opportunities that could be ignored, as, for example, when the records collected by Sir Thomas Phillips began to be dispersed. It took 50 years for that dispersal, their sale, to be completed, but early on, the Society was a beneficiary. Sir Thomas Phillips was described as a velomaniac, meaning that he was addicted to parchment, and he amassed a collection of 60,000 manuscripts and 40,000 printed books, and was said to have had more manuscripts, had the largest collection of manuscripts of anyone in the 19th century. But they were all broken up and sold and dispersed in multiple directions, including to the Society. Sometimes collections came from, relatively speaking, humbler sources. In 1871, a loyal member of the Society, George Sweetman of Wincanton, was at a Society meeting when a Society member said incautiously, "Wincanton has no history." George Sweetman was outraged. He was an autodidact who'd gone to work at the age of 8, taught himself at evening school, and ultimately prospered as a shopkeeper and as the publisher of Sweetman's Illustrated Journal, which ran for 9 years. After his death, his collections relating to Wincanton, which were extensive and really important, were purchased by Charles Tite, another great benefactor of the Society, and given into the Society's care. And the same happened to the manuscripts of George Bennett, who had been an antiquarian researcher in the area around Weston and Banwell. And this was acquired for the Society in that same period. There's one opening from one of many volumes, and there's another opening, a copy of an early picture of the marketplace at Axbridge. I was at Chaffcombe recently, photographing the church, and I went round the back of the church and spotted a gravestone, and it had on it an unmistakable name, Arthur Hull. Well, I didn't know he was buried at Chaffcombe, and perhaps few people have heard of Arthur Hull, but it's a name that resonates with me. It told me on his gravestone that he was the founder of the Chard Museum and that he died in 1880. And I knew that he had also been a principal benefactor to the society. For in 1916, a large trunk was received by Harold St. George Grey, filled with papers relating to Chard, the Chard Turnpike Trust, the Chard Workhouse, everything to do with Chard. Arthur Hull had been an omnivorous collector. And not least, it contained a marvelous collection of handbills, hundreds and hundreds of them, the strongest collection of such documents that survives in the county. Here, for example, is just one of them. 14 years transportation, the life of a convict, will be illustrated in a lecture at the large room, the Paul at Arms in Chard in 1847. And at the bottom it says, at the conclusion, the lecturer will appear in the convict's dress, chains, etc., as worn in Norfolk Island. And there, just randomly, is another handbill from the Arthur Hull collection. As I say, it was received in a trunk in 1916, but Harold St. George Grey rather turned his nose up at it, or he was also very, very busy as an archaeologist and a curator. But it remained unopened and untouched until 1958, when it was finally sent to the new Somerset Record Office, as it then was, and Ivor Collis, who was also rather lofty in his view of a material of this kind, finally brought it into the light of day. Ivor Collis was the first post-war county archivist. Other things that were given them included this Broom, this rental of the abbot of Cirencester relating to Froome from 1392. It was given by the Right Honourable Henry Hobhouse in 1927. And again, at the very top in the right, you can see one of Florence St. George Grey's little labels. And just a few classes of records which came in those over that period of time. For the society managed to accumulate many parish records, records which would not otherwise have survived, including, for example, the churchwarden's accounts of Taunton St. Mary from the 1680s to the 1760s. And lots of wills, many of them probably derive from Thomas Serrell and from the cathedral. But it's impossible to say now. All we know is that the society has many early wills, and that is a great blessing to Somerset historians, because so many of what remained were destroyed in 1942 in Exeter. And there are maps as well, including some spectacular ones, like this map of the Mendip Minories from about 1600, showing the lead mining areas on the Mendips, an endeavour that peaked in the 1600s, about 1600 to 1670, although, of course, its roots lay in the Roman period. And there were more workaday maps as well, such as this map of Yatton from 1800 and a map of East Brent from 1825. They came from solicitors' offices, from all kinds of places, from people who would otherwise simply have thrown them away. And it was very lucky that the society was there to take them in. The society began to realize that, well, I'll say that later, but yeah, and other documents in the late days of the Society, while it still remained a collector of archives, were purchased, for example, through the bequest fund left by Charles Tite. And here are some Somerset visitations purchased from the Tite, with the Tite Fund money in 1931. And here some documents from the collection of Ernest E. Baker of Weston-super-Mare, a member of SANHS since 1883, its president in 1929. He died in 1931, and although he had given the Society some records already, including 6 volumes of manuscripts relating to the bishopric of Bath and Wells, much still remained and was purchased after his death for the Society. They also bought this, Locke's Survey of Somerset from 1806, which is a very valuable supplement to Collinson's history. It was, as it were, a parallel attempt to survey the whole county, parish by parish. And some things given in those days just before the Second World War are a little perplexing. Although very welcome, here is a page from the Chronicles of England printed at Westminster by William Caxton in 1480. An extraordinary thing to possess. It was given by Mr. Boys Penrose, a distinguished American historian, travel writer, and collector of rare books. He was the nephew of a much more famous United States senator called Boys Penrose, who died in 1921 and who was known as Big Grizzly. He was 6'4" tall and had a voracious appetite. He was known to eat a dozen eggs for breakfast and a full turkey at lunch. And just before the Society ceased to collect in a determined way, it received some very important additions to its archive collection. In 1946, the Marquess of Aylesbury donated 2 documents, amongst others. This, a cartulary of Lady Cecilia de Beauchamp from the late 13th century. And this, one of the most spectacular records in the whole collection, not just the SANHS collection, but the whole archive collection, the Charter of Ethelred II from AD 995, whereby Muchelney Abbey whereby Ilminster and West Camel are given to Muchelney Abbey. And I well remember in 1995, a year that Ilminster celebrated its millennium on the basis of this charter, taking the charter down to the Minster Church for the grand celebratory service and being honoured to process up the aisle with the Society's Anglo-Saxon charter, which was placed on the altar throughout that service. And this, as it were, something that rounded off the period of acquisition. In 1948, Florence St. George Grey appears with her own money to have acquired the memoirs of John Cannon, and in the same year gave it to the Society. It was one of her noblest gestures to the Society, because this document, which covers the period 1684 to 1743 and runs to 600,000 words, has been called the poor man's Pepys. John Cannon's memoirs is the poor man's Pepys diary. It's an extraordinary bird's eye view of life, or no, worm's eye view more like, of life in Somerset as it was lived. John Cannon was an excise officer, and his memoirs describe the harsh realities of rural life. And he does so with extraordinary, almost unique candor. He talks of his business dealings, of his many quarrels, of his bell ringing, of his sexual preoccupations, of his quarrels with his wife. There is, so the scholars tell us, nothing in the whole canon of diaries from that period which quite matches the memoirs of Mr. John Cannon. There's another 2 pages from it. including his calculations around an eclipse seen over Glastonbury, and his little drawing of the market house at Glastonbury. As a coda to the talk, I thought I'd just briefly sketch in what happened thereafter, after the society ceased, as it were, to be a determined collector. Well, already in 1935, they could see that the world had changed, for it was in that year that Somerset County Council appointed the first county archivist, Miss Dermot Harding, and there you see her. A woman of extraordinary drive and ability, and her fingerprints are still all over the way Somerset archives were organized and brought into the 20th century. And quite soon the society recognized that the record office at Shire Hall under a professional archivist was the fit place for its own records to go. And from 1935 onwards, it began to transfer the records to county custody, though not to county ownership. And Harold St. George Grey would walk from the castle down the Crescent with as many records as he could hold and hand them over to Miss Dermot Harding, who would then list them and keep them safe. And here is a list of the very first accession of society archives that came into County Council custody. Deeds of Chilcompton. And in that same period of the late 1930s, the Exchequer Room was cleared of its documents of what we call the Shepherd Collection, the records of the Manor of Taunton Dean. And again, Harold St. George Grey recognised that a new organisation with a new professional archivist would be better able to deal with a challenge which was by now enormous and beyond the capacity of one man to have any hope of dealing with. But Miss Dermot Harding didn't last for long, for in 1942 she got married, and she was sacked because you weren't allowed to be married. And so her deputy, Miss Elsas, took over until they discovered that she was German, and so she was sacked as well. And that left Harold St. George Grey as de facto county archivist. There was just no one left standing. And so he did the work that no one else was able to do. But he still took records over to the strong rooms at Shire Hall. And still, piece by piece, the Society's archive holdings were given a new home. And in 1958, when the first post-war archivist, Ivor Cullis, was 12 years in post, he managed through his focus and determination to build a new purpose-built county record office for Somerset at Oakbridge Road. And there you see it. It was the latest thing in 1958, the first purpose-built record office of the post-war era. And there is the first exhibition containing lots of society documents. And there you see Mr. Collis later on in a slide that he would use in talks, showing how he could convert the bookcases in the search room into exhibition boards. He was a sort of Heath Robinson inventor. He invented all kinds of things, including a new method of repairing maps, which was subsequently adopted all over the world, the wall-mounted repair of maps. And there you see John Adams repairing a map in the new Somerset Record Office, probably in about 1960. And here is a man who's very important in the history of the Society. This is Ivor Collis's successor, Derek Shorrocks, county archivist. And there is the office where I first met him years ago when he offered me a job, a temporary job as it was at the time. He listed vast swathes of the Society's collection. He also, as president of the Society, gave his presidential address on the history of the SANHS archives. And I owe much to that presidential address for what I've said to you this evening. And there, just arbitrarily, are some of the archivists at the Record Office at Oakbridge Road. I don't know why I showed that. I meant to delete this one, but since it's here, I'll show you. There's Robin Bush at his desk. He was the assistant county archivist, and for a year he was chair of the Archaeological Society and very important in its history. And in the other picture, you see all the staff of the Record Office in about 1986, and I'm on the right in the back row, far right on the back row. Not quite a lot of the people in that picture are no longer with us. The Society still had a presence at Taunton Castle, even when the archives moved out first to Shire Hall and then to Oakbridge Road. For its library was still in one whole wing of the castle. And David Bromwich, whom you see there in the old local history library, was the presiding genius over the library, and in a way still is, though it's not in those premises anymore. And over time, and particularly in 1996, the library also moved from the castle premises, so that the Adam Library was freed up and the SANHS library collection, or most of it, found a new home on the upper floor of Taunton Public Library. But then in 2010, the new Somerset Heritage Centre was created. And a year later, the Earl of Wessex, as he then was, officially opened the building. Now it was possible for SANHS to make its headquarters here, or at least its office headquarters here, and also for all the reserve collections, the library, the archive, and the museum reserve collections to be gathered together for the first time in many years on the same site. And there is the SANHS archive collection as it exists in the strong rooms of the new Heritage Centre. That wasn't the end of the discovery of archives, for part of the process of moving out of the Taunton Town Library and also finalizing the move out of the castle was that a lot of additional material was found, and that was subsequently listed, as you see here. Chiefly, or a lot of it was listed by Mary Ciro, this year's president of the Society. And so, although the SANHS archives now exist in a modern state-of-the-art building, and a lot of what went before has been forgotten, we can be certain, and I hope to an extent I've helped to sketch in, that none of this would have happened without the effort, the vision, the commitment, and the determination of so many people in the early days. You see some of them there. Standing in the middle there with the moustache is Harold St. George Grey. On his right, holding his hat, is standing the Reverend F.W. Weaver, very important in the history of the Society, the man who edited the Cartulary of Minchin Buckland Priory. In the front row is the President, Sir Edward Fry. And Florence St. George Grey is probably there somewhere, but I'm not quite sure which one she is. So we owe a great deal to the past for the extraordinary collection which has been preserved by the efforts of so many people. It's a wonderfully diverse collection. Derek Shorrocks called it a record office in miniature. And I'm going to end with this slide and an indication, or at least an example, of that wonderful diversity. It's a copybook written by Dr. Thomas Young, described by some as the last man who knew everything. He was born in Milverton and gained fame as the man who, in part, deciphered the Rosetta Stone. He was an extraordinary polymath, And when he was still only young, he was able to translate a given passage into 13 different languages. And the book in which he did that is preserved in the Society's archives. And what does it say in English? Perhaps it should be a warning to us all in our troubled times. The world is a sea full of crocodiles. Happy is the man who bideth on the shore. Thank you for listening.
Oh, Tom, that was really wonderful and so exciting for me, at least, to see what is actually residing in the SANHS archives, because a lot of it I've obviously never seen, but you, as in your role, looking after these things, will know most of them quite intimately, I imagine.
Well, I certainly know many of them. There are a lot of familiar friends there, yes.
Yes, yes, and what a wonderful collection. I was just thinking, what foresight of these our predecessors to actually consider the importance of the collection of that kind. Quite remarkable people, really. Yeah. Well, we have a few questions coming in, and anybody who's watching, please don't forget to put questions onto the chat button, and I will read them out. Um, Starting at the very top, we've got one here that says, asking about the Wellington, the
Verados.
reredos. Yeah, yeah, that's right, and wondering how it managed to lose its paint, because obviously the reconstruction was there.
Yes, it began to fade early on. It had been laid flat as paving round the altar. And C.E. Giles, who was an architect and worked on many, many Somerset churches, was the person who restored, in inverted commas, St. John's Church, Wellington. And he discovered it. And at the point of discovery, the colours were still very vivid.
Mm,
And he captured them in that lithograph. But I think they began to fade very swiftly when they were exposed to air. And now, although there are still traces of paint on the reredos, it clearly doesn't look like what it looked like at that moment of
mm.
revelation in 48.
Yes, extra. I'd heard that it was actually upside down, being reused upside down, and that's
Yeah.
probably not helped the paintwork at all, I would have thought.
Mm.
Yes, it's sometimes quite hard to imagine that so many of our churches in particular were actually brightly coloured, because we've got so used to the stonework being just stonework, which was then fashionable, I suppose, in the Victorian times. Yeah,
Yes, yes, that's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
true.
yeah. Now another question here. Why do you think there used to be general attitude that keeping records was not important? And that was quite shocking to me. Um, Plainly, some people thought they were important, but the idea that they might be of interest to people in the future presumably didn't really hold.
Um, Well, some people thought they were important. Records historically had always been thought important as evidences. Title deeds were very important and would be very carefully preserved. So in the country houses of Somerset, those evidences were preserved from an early date in places like Dunster Castle with the Luttrell papers, or at Nettlecombe, the Trevelyan's.
Mm.
Uh, but in general, they were not highly regarded. They were regarded as ephemeral, as detritus. Um, and some of the manuscripts that Cyril rescued, especially, or at least the parchment ones, they were used in the 19th century by ladies who made jam for jam pot covers. Uh,
It's quite shocking, isn't it? Yeah. And I was quite shocked to hear that somebody had been using them to start fires with. But
yes, the theological college used them to light fires. The butcher
mhm,
used them to wrap meat.
yeah,
Uh, the some people use them as jam pot covers. But they weren't highly valued. However,
yeah,
there was a great sea change in attitudes from the late 18th century onwards,
yeah.
and gradually, I think the tide turned.
It's interesting that, isn't it? Do you suppose that people suddenly developed an interest in history, or started valuing old things for some reason?
Well, it links to the Romantic movement and people like Coleridge and Wordsworth, and a sense that understanding the individual within a society was important, that the past was important, and of course, the Gothic revival and a harking back to the Middle Ages.
Yes, yeah,
That all began to
all
be very,
works
very
together. Yeah,
late 18th century onwards.
yeah, very interesting. Okay, well, we've got a few questions coming in now. Somebody would like to know, are objects still coming into the collection? And how many important items do you think are buried away amongst people's stuff, still waiting to be found?
Well, the society as a collector stopped, as it were, to try to collect in 1958. Some things still come in. 1958 was the year that the museum was leased to the county council and the year the county record office opened. So, but in terms of the county collection in the round, yes, material still does come in. It's still acquired by purchase and gift and loan.
Mm.
Uh, there are probably a few treasures lurking in attics, but fewer than there were 50, 60, 70 years ago when there was a tidal wave of material. There were wonderful stories or letters describing Miss Dermot Harding in her very small car chasing after the Pickford's van on the way to the next workhouse to collect workhouse records in the 1930s. The sort of heroic days of archive collecting are perhaps over, but material still does turn up.
Yes, always think it's really exciting because you hear on the news that somebody will have discovered an old bit of Beethoven music that had never been heard before, and I always think it's wonderful the possibility that there might be things out there still to find. Yeah.
Well, I've no doubt there are, but they appear less frequently now.
Well, of course, yes. As people do up their houses, I suppose there's less attics for things to malinger in.
Yes.
Yeah. One of my favourites is about the box which had the John Martin letters in. And I think that must have been almost the highlight of your career to be allowed to just unpack. And it's so exciting because there's so many little within that box, little compartments, all keeping lots of different letters. It must have been a wonderful thing to do.
It was, and there's one of the finest Coleridge letters in that collection.
Really, yeah.
Really, it's his magnificent brush off to Edwin Atherstone, who was seeking an invitation to Coleridge's sort of soiree, which he held on Tuesday evenings. And Coleridge wrote him a three-page letter saying, "Please, you would not be welcome." But it is a most magnificent brush off.
Yes. how, how awful for him. Oh, wonderful. Well, I think that's about the end of our questions now. Thank you ever so much. We've got a lot of people who've written in to say thank you. And the lovely thing is that it will be on YouTube for people to go and have a look at a later date. So thank you, Tom, again for doing that wonderful talk. It was great.
Thank you. Thanks.
So we're just a few notices now to read out before the end of the webinar. Um, Our next webinar will be on the 19th of February, and John Page will be talking about the Banwell Bone Caves, which is a very interesting area to go and learn a little bit more about. So that's the 19th of February. In terms of SANHS event, on the 24th of January, that's this Saturday coming up, we have the wonderful Neil Wilson, who runs the Radio Museum in Watchet, will be coming to the Wyndham Hall to give a talk about the history of radio in the Southwest. So that's on Saturday afternoon at 2:30. Next month, in February the 12th, we've got a SANHS visit to the old priory in Dunster and also having a look around the Luttrell Arms. So that's going to be a very special visit indeed. That's the 12th of February. You will need to book for that one. On the 28th of February, David Dawson will be talking about what I always think of as the Mummy Project, when Bristol Museum was forced to unpack a mummy, and David Dawson will be able to talk about that as he was deeply involved with it at the time, and that is also at the Wyndham Hall on the 28th of February. All these are listed on the Society website. Our associated societies are also very busy this month. Frome Society for Local Studies is having a talk on Saturday the 24th, coming up this Saturday, about Frome fables. On the 27th of January, on Tuesday, the Exmoor Society has an evening with Fleming Ulf Hansen at Dulverton Town Hall. Also on the 27th of January, next Tuesday, Martock History Group will be having a talk about James Quantock, the 18th century polymath Ed Lorch. On the 28th of January, on the Wednesday, Harptrees History Society has a talk on Hannah More by Dr. Joe Edwards. On the 28th of January again, Tintinhull Local History Group will be having a talk about the skeleton behind the plough, the plight of agricultural labourers, and George Mitchell of Montacute. And also on Friday, 6th of February, Wells Natural History Society, Natural History and Archaeological Society are having a talk on mining and the Somerset coalfield by Brian Hawkins. And alongside all this, don't forget, Wyndham Hall Picture House on the 5th of February will be showing a film about the woman at war, which is a surprising, touching, and also funny film all about women at war, which should not be missed, and quite fun to watch. And there we have it. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming this evening. Thank you very much to our webinar team who are beavering away behind the scenes as always, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar on the 19th of February. So thank you and good night.